Listen now to the gospel reading. Today, reading from the gospel according to St. Luke, from the 17th chapter. Hear this word. Now the apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." The Lord replied, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you. Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once, take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron and serve me while I eat and drink. Later you may eat and drink'? Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.' The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God shall stand forever." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Grant, O Lord, that we might be the masters of ourselves to become the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for Thee. Amen. The parable of the mustard seed is a favorite of mine, and I suppose through the years I've preached on it at least a dozen times, probably more. One in particular, I had a response that sticks with me, and that is that one time I preached on this parable, and afterward, a lady in the congregation, when we were greeting after the service, showed me that that Sunday she had just happened to wear a necklace that had it was a little necklace with a glass pendant, and inside was a single solitary. Have you ever seen those pendants? They're fairly common. She told me she got it from J.C. Penney. Not the store J.C. Penney, mind you, but James Cash Penney, the person for whom J.C. Penney was the CEO, the founder of J.C. Penney. Apparently, and I went online, you can find this online actually, J.C. Penney gave away thousands of mustard seed necklaces through the course of his life, because that was, you could write to him personally, not the company, but you would write to him as the CEO, and he would send you one free. He gave away thousands of them because the parable changed his life. And his story is really kind of an interesting one. J.C. Penney, James Cash Penney, was brought up in the early part of the 20th century in Missouri, rural Missouri, born into an impoverished family there, and when he was 12 years old, the story goes, his father said that from now on he would have to earn his own money and buy his own clothes. He would still get fed at the family, but he'd have to come up with money for his own clothes, 12 years old, and that's how he began to be interested in clothes early on. That's natural. I better figure out, what clothes are going to last for me or whatever it is. But anyway, not long after this, when Penney was still a boy, his dad lost his job in Missouri and his family relocated to Colorado, where J.C. Penney got a job as a clerk in a small dry goods store. And he was a good hard worker, the story goes, and he was also very frugal with his money. He saved money very carefully, and which was a good thing, because not too long after he had got a job at that store, it failed. And so as a young man, not yet 20, he didn't know what to do. He was done with high school and had saved a little stake of money as working as a clerk. And so what he did was relocate to the little town of Kemmerer, Wyoming, which is a little bit of a town in the far southwest corner of Wyoming. I go through it occasionally to this day on trout fishing trips. And J.C. Penney relocated to Kemmerer, and with his little stake, he opened the very first J.C. Penney dry goods store. You can still see it in downtown Kemmerer. It's kind of a landmark there. The first Penney store, and lo and behold, it took off. And by the early 1920s, he became one of the wealthiest business people in the Mountain West. He moved into a big house in Salt Lake City, and he opened several dozen stores in the Intermountain West there, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado. Everything looked great for him until the stock market crash in 1929. He lost everything in one day. He went from being on top of the world to literally having nothing. And he became deeply depressed, the story goes, enough so that he checked himself into what was then called a sanitarium. We would call it a mental hospital now, in Battle Creek, Michigan. And it was there that the mustard seed parable came into his life. The story goes he was in the hospital in the depths of his depression, and one night he heard down the hall singing. It was the worship service going on. It was being conducted in the chapel there at the sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. And by his own words, he was struck by the hymn. Be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you. Those words were what he heard coming down from the chapel, and it intrigued him enough. He walked down and sat down at the very back of the room as the group was singing, and lo and behold, for the first time in his life, at that service, he came to understand that God cared for him and that there was possibility for his life, not just in terms of what he could acquire materially, but spiritually as a child of God. And the passage that was read in the sanitarium in Battle Creek that night was the parable of the mustard seed. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this sycamore tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. That was what struck J.C. Penney, and it was the start of a new life in the sense that he all of a sudden came to the awareness that he didn't have to have it all together, religiously speaking, in order to move forward. He just had to have the willingness to use the little faith that he did have and see what would happen. And lo and behold, it became the turning point for him going forward. It's a favorite parable of mine, too. In the parable, did you notice that the immediate thing that precipitates Jesus using this parable is a request from the disciples? Lord, increase our faith. That was the trigger for telling this story. And you have to believe that at this particular point in their lives, we're not exactly sure why, the disciples are in some bit of a desperate state too, maybe not all that different from J.C. Penney. They are worried whether they are going to be able to live up to the high expectations that are being put for them. That's what I suspect. Jesus has taken them through the demands of discipleship. What do you have to do? Whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever will lose his life for my sake will find it. If somebody asks for your coat, give him your cloak as well. If somebody compels you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. They've heard all of these difficult, demanding things that are part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and I suspect that there was at least something going on with them that said, well, if we're going to have to do this kind of stuff, we're going to have more faith than we have now. Lord, increase our faith, they say. Apparently feeling like they're not going to be up for the task. And Jesus, in response, tells them that parable. I want you to notice that the assumption behind the request of the disciples, understandable though it is, we need more faith if we're going to be able to do this. That is a common assumption. The assumption is that faith, I think many people make this assumption, faith is kind of a quantitative thing. You can store it up. Faith is something you can accumulate so that the more you have, the more you can do. Jesus confounds that with that parable. Notice, Jesus says, if you got just a little bit of faith, the smallest seed of faith, you got all you need. You don't need a lot of faith because faith is not a thing. I mean, that's what's implied in the parable. It's not something you accumulate, something you possess like, physical strength or wealth or anything like that. I mean, think about this for a minute. If you have only a little bit of physical strength, if you've got just little muscles, then you can only do a few things. But if you've got a lot of strength, if you've got big, powerful muscles, you can do big, impressive things. And the disciples, notice, they think that faith is kind of like that. It's like we've got to build up our spiritual muscles so that the more we have, the more we can do. And Jesus says, no. No, faith is not like muscle power. It's not like cash, so that the more you have, the more you can buy, the more you can do. Faith is not quantitative, it's qualitative. Faith is a relationship. Faith is trusting God. That's what it is at its very simplest essence. Faith is trusting God. And since that's true, either you trust God or you don't. There's no quantifying that. Either you have that trust or you don't, which means it's not how much faith you have, but how willing you are to employ the trust that's in you, be it a little or a lot, and live in a way that trust shapes your life. That's what makes a difference. That's what the parable implies. And in that way, the parable is simply just a distillation of what we read in the Bible from front to back. When you read the Bible, you see a central repeating theme of people who trust God and then do amazing things for which they were not qualified to do. I love that about the Bible. You know, I don't know if sometimes I get up in the morning, you know, I look in the mirror and I think to myself, you know, there's got to be somebody who could do this job better than me. You know, there's got to be somebody who's deeper and more spiritual and more in tune. And I think it's just a natural human thing when you think about living as a child of God to say, I am so inadequate to do what I'm called to do. But the Bible, I love, that's what I love. One of the great things of the Bible is the Bible's full of people who do the things of God even though they're not qualified to do the things of God. That's what it's all about. Think about David and Goliath story, just the classic story in the Old Testament of facing life, all of its dangers and difficulties with faith alone. I mean, David is just the lad, utterly unqualified to go up against Goliath, the great giant. You know, I mean, when I think of Goliath, I think about, in terms of being unassailable and unbeatable, I think about that women's soccer team, coming out onto the field, and I think their opponents must think they look like giants. They just are so unstoppable force in terms of their capacity. So David goes up against the unstoppable giant, and the point of the story is utterly simple. Goliath is huge and strong, got all the muscles, armed to the teeth. David is small, weak, no armor at all, little strength, little power. But of course, surprise, he defeats the giant. Because why? He was armed with trust in God alone to bring him through. And that story, and many like it, were repeatedly told to the Jews, not just as a child's fable, but to remind them what they would often forget, and to remind us what we often forget, that they had done great things and miraculous things as long as they were diligent to keep track of where they put their trust, in God and nowhere else. I mean, think about their history. I mean, the ancient Israelites, utterly unlikely to be the chosen people, but there they are, freed from bondage in Egypt. The Egyptians were the strongest, most powerful army in the world at that point. And they are delivered from the Egyptians by trusting God. They pass through the waters of the Red Sea by trusting God against all odds. And then they find themselves not in safety, but out in the wilderness, where they've got to wander for 40 years, not knowing where the next day's food is coming from. By trusting God. They enter the promised land. They become a great nation under King David, trusting God. And of course, periodically they would forget that, just like we do. For off and on in their history, they would decide they would want to live like other nations and not trust God. They want to put their trust in kings or in armaments or in wealth. They wanted to be strong in worldly terms. But again and again in the Bible, these stories are told to bring them, and by extension us, back to our senses. And remember, that's not the way you become great. You become great putting your hand in the hand of God, like David going up against Goliath. And to have faith means to trust that God will stand with you the next time you have to do that again. That's the core of the parable. If you have faith, Lord, increase our faith, and he says, no, you don't need more faith. If you have faith like a mustard seed, you can order that sycamore tree to be uprooted, thrown into the sea, and it will obey you. The problem's not the amount of faith you have. The problem, or the possibility, I would say, is the call to use what you have and see what God will do with it. You know, Bible school is coming up here at next week, and we've been talking about Vacation Bible School a lot in staff meetings over the last couple of weeks. And thinking of Bible school reminds me of a story my mother likes to tell, something that happened to her a few years back. My mother, who is well up in her 80s now, a couple of years ago, was asked to help out with the Vacation Bible School at her little local church where my mom and dad have been members forever, the Methodist Church over in Hoopston. And one year, a couple of years back, they decided they were going to try to do something different for Bible school. And instead of having the Bible school at the church, where they have always had it since, time began, they said, why not just for fun, we have it over at that apartment complex behind the foundry that's closed, over on the northwest side of town. That's the part of town that's called Greater Hoopston, but all the locals say there's really nothing greater about it. It's the rundown part of town, and there's an old kind of dilapidated apartment building behind the old John Deere foundry where they used to forge engine blocks. It's been closed for years, and the church said, just for something different, why don't we see if we could get a vacant apartment over there and have Bible school there, in that side of town. And it was a kind of a controversial thing. Some church folks said, why are we doing this? They're not church people over there. They're not much of anything over there. We just do it the way we always do it. I don't see why we would want to do that. But, they decided to try. And my mom was part of the visiting group that went door to door in that apartment complex to invite people the week before it started. She said, I was the visiting committee. It was comprised of me and only me. She said one particular conversation that she remembered the most was going up to one of those dilapidated apartment doors and hearing, she said, I heard this pulsing music coming out. The door was kind of blowing like that, And I could tell it wasn't people singing, it was kind of a chant. And I couldn't make out many of the words, but the words I could make out, I won't tell you what they were. But I knocked on the door, and the door opened, and she said there was a young woman, had a toddler on her hip, and another about a 5-year-old running around in the room, and a cigarette dangling down from her lips. And she said, you want something? And my mother said, at that moment, what I really wanted was to be somewhere else. But I had my line, and I offered my line. I said, we're going to have Vacation Bible School just downstairs and down the hallway. And there'll be refreshments, and there's crafts, and your kids would be most welcome. You'd be welcome to come as well. And it starts next week from 4 to 7 each evening. I hope you'd come. She said, what is it? I said, Vacation Bible School, the Methodist Church. The church down there by the Lorraine Theater across the street. That's the church that's putting it on. We're putting it on just in your building this year. You'd be most welcome. She said, I ain't ever been part of no church. But will you watch my kids? I said, sure, we'll watch them. You can come too, but you don't have to. We'll watch them, and you can pick them up at 7. I said, well, we'll see. We'll see. Lo and behold, the next week, she was one of the families that brought those kids. And at first, the first couple nights, Mom said she just dropped them off and went her way and then would come back and get them. The third night, she stayed and she watched, and she had cookies and Kool-Aid with the kids, and she was quite interested. And she stayed the remaining several nights. And my mom said what really was amazing to her was that about 2 weeks after Bible school was over, she showed up at church. And my mom said, she comes to this day. It's been several. She doesn't come every week, but she comes more than most people. And my mom says, every time I see that young lady and her kids come through the door, I know it doesn't matter whether the sermon's any good or not. I've had spiritual uplift, I feel like it's I've seen the goodness of God, a kind of minor miracle unfold right before me. And, for me, it's kind of a mustard seed story. You never know. You just don't have the slightest idea when God causes seeds to take root and grow. So the point of the parable, of course, is, since you don't know, you got to be generous in planting those seeds. Use that faith, even though you may not think you can do it as well as somebody else can do it. It's the most liberating lesson in your life to know you don't have to be qualified to be bearers of the grace and goodness of God. Thank God for that. You don't have to, neither do I. We just have to get out there and plant those seeds. I think if you ask 40 people you could stop on the sidewalk, what is the opposite of faith? People would say doubt. It's intellectual doubt. I have some doubts, therefore I don't have faith. But this story just reminds us in a helpful way, faith doesn't remove doubt. Faith is the courage to go into an unknown future in spite of doubts. And that's kind of an important difference to know. Faith doesn't remove doubt, and it doesn't remove fear either. Faith gives you the courage to do the right thing, even when your knees are knocking, even when you'd rather be somewhere else. Faith is more like courage than it is like certainty. And I don't know if there's maybe something going on in your life, maybe not. Maybe you come here with some disappointment today or some fear about your future, something that worries you. If you did, this passage is for you, because the good news, according to the parable, is you've got the faith you need and you've got the God you need. You already have it. Just trust it. Just use it and plant the seed, and you'll be amazed what happens.